Hello. Today I want to talk to you about trend lines. Now this is not about how to draw a trend line on the screen. It's not about how to write code to get the values from the trend lines. It's not even about how to write the code to place the trend lines on the screen. This is something more fundamental. This is about how to write the code to find where the trend lines should be. And it's often not as easy as it sounds. So on the screen here, I've got an example. I've drawn lines to bound the segment that I'm looking at. I'm not including the bars that are on these vertical lines. I'm just including the bars in between. And the types of lines I'm looking at today are tangential to the high or low points. So you can see this upper trend line just touches two high points and doesn't intersect with any other candles except these that are already outside the range. And the lower trend line just touches two low points and doesn't intersect with any other candles. Now it might seem like that's not very difficult, but let me show a couple of changes. I'll get rid of the lower trend line just so things are not so confused. If I look at this upper trend line, you might say we'll just draw through the two highest points, but you move this a little bit. This is the highest point, and this is the next highest point, and that's not a very good trend line. You might say just find any 2 points that don't intersect with other candles. Well, I can do that by using this point and this point. Also not a very good trend line. So the hard part about writing the code is to understand what the decision is and how to calculate where those points are. Let me start out by moving this line a little. And if you can imagine this line as, let's say, a stick, a real object, and you place it here and then drop it down onto these points, so it comes down. First thing it's going to do is touch this high point. After that, most of the line, or most of this stick, is to the right hand side of that point, and gravity begins to do its thing. So let me move that point so I've got a pivot here. Now gravity begins to pull this down until the line touches this next high point. Now at that point, we still have too much of the line over here, and if this were a real stick, gravity would still want to pull it down, but this will form a new pivot point. So I'll move that point to there, and then the line will continue to come down, and you can see now that we've left behind the original high point, so the line no longer touches that. And eventually we get to a point where it's now just touching this candle. Remember, I'm ignoring this one here that's got the line through it. The line's just to show the end of the segment. So now I have a line that just touches two high points. Maybe I should have stopped at this line. Just lift that a little bit. There. It's getting confused now. Probably should have stopped there. Yes. So that's the process that we would go through to find these points. But you can imagine that if I started with a horizontal line and slowly moved down, testing every point on the way to see where I touched a line, that's a lot of iterations. There is a faster way to do this. When you look at what's happening, we started by selecting the highest point. That's a natural starting place. And then after that, as this line comes down, the slope is gradually increasing. And it's that slope that I'm going to be using to find the next points. Now, you also need to note that this sloped downwards. It's an upper trend line and it's sloping downwards because the high point is to the left of the middle. If the high point were to the right of the middle, then the left-hand side would have been coming down and I'd have an upward sloping upper trend line. And if I do this from the bottom, if you can imagine gravity working in reverse, it would touch this point first, and then the line would move up on the left, so I would have a downward sloping lower trend line. And if this low point were on the left-hand side, then I'd have an upward sloping lower trend line. So there are four conditions then. An upper trend line can slope down or up, and a lower trend line can slope down or up. And the slope is determined by which side the high or the low point is of the center of the range. So what we're going to do is write code as a class that you can use where you can supply a starting point and a number of bars to calculate. So in this case, how big is this range? I've got 39 bars in this range. So you'd supply a starting bar number of bars to include in the range, and then the class will calculate a point, not necessarily one of these points, but that's not important, and the slope. So remembering that the standard equation for a straight line, y equals mx plus c, c is a starting point and m is the slope. So the class will calculate that slope, and from that it can give to you the value at any bar along the history of the chart. So now we'll go straight to the code and begin to write the class. Now I'm in the editor. This is the MT5 editor, MQL5, but the code that I'm going to write here in this MQH file is common for MT5 and MT4, and at the end of writing the class I'll actually create a script that will demonstrate this, and the script will work in both MT4 and MT5. So I've already created here under my Orchard folder in the include, I've created a folder called trendlines, and I've created a trend-high-low.mqh file. That's this file that's open. It already has the property statements, and I'm including object.mqh. That's a standard file supplied with MetaTrader because I want to inherit from CObject. As I mentioned, the standard equation for a line has a point and a slope. So I'm declaring a structure here that I'm calling strendPoint, and this will give me a point on that line. And it just has the bar number, the price for that point on the bar, and I'm also adding in the time, although I won't be using it today. Of course, the point isn't enough. I also need the slope. So I'm declaring a second structure that I'm calling strend, and that has the slope and includes strendPoint for the base point. So now I can begin to write the class. Now I'm calling the class cTrendHighLow because there are many approaches to drawing high and low trend lines, different types of lines. So not all lines are, as I'm describing here, where they're tangential and don't intersect with other candles. Some lines will allow you to intersect. This is one particular line type, and I will have follow-up videos in the future where I look at some of the others as well. But this is called cTrendHighLow, public inheritance from CObject, which I've pulled in from this include object.mqh. I don't have anything in private. I'm going to be maintaining a symbol and a time frame variable, although for today I'm only going to be using the chart symbol and the chart time frame, but I'm going to be storing them in the class here. Then, as I said, there is a start bar for calculation of the segment and the length of the segment in bars. This will calculate both an upper and lower trend, so I have two of these strend structures, the upper trend and the lower trend. And then I have an internal calculation that's called value at, and this will take an index, being a bar number, and one of the trend objects, and that's because I'm going to pass in either the upper or the lower trend. So this is a protected method, so you can't call this directly, and it's used internally, and I have other methods coming that you can call externally. Next, I'm just declaring my constructors and destructors, and as I said, there's a start bar and a length, and I'm just setting defaults to those for starting at 1 and length of 20. But I would normally expect that you'd pass these in the constructor. Now, given that this has a starting bar number, every time a new bar is created, you probably want to update this and recalculate. So I have an update method, and I also have an update lower and an update upper. So you can recalculate just one or the other. The update method, when we get to that, you'll see just calls each of these two. And next I have the public methods that we'll be calling this value at. And so these are the methods that you will call to get the value of a point on that trend line. And there's no need to actually draw the trend line on chart. This will just calculate a virtual trend line for you, and you can simply call this class and ask what is the value of the trend line at this bar number or this time. So I have four methods. There's upper and lower value methods, upper value at, and one method takes an index, which is a bar number, and the other method takes a time, and then it will calculate the bar number based on that time. and these will simply look at the upper trend line or the lower trend line and return the value of that trend line at that bar number or time. And now when I include values like this in the constructor, they need to be there to get started, but you might change these later while this class is running. So I'm going to create some properties to modify these. So the start property, the int start will just return the current value, and the void start lets you set a new value for that start bar number. The length, same thing, returns the length or sets a new value for the length. And both of these will call the update method. That's this one, after they've been changed. So just changing the start or the length will cause the recalculation of the trend lines. I'll create the constructor and destructor methods first, these two. So the constructor, two arguments, start and length. It stores the symbol variable and the time frame variable from the chart symbol and the chart period, and I'm casting this period, which returns an integer, into an enum time frames. And that helps to make this compatible with MetaTrader 5. And then I'm just storing the start and the length in the mstart and mlength variables, and then calling update on the initialization just so that we actually get a trend. And then the destructor, but there's no code in here. So next, the update method. And that simply calls update lower and update upper. Now, when you think about it, I said there are 4 different conditions: an upper uptrend, an upper downtrend, a lower uptrend, and a lower downtrend. And the code between those is all very similar, but it's just different enough to be annoying. So I could write one piece of code that has a lot of conditions in it, but to make this a little easier to understand, I'm actually going to be duplicating some code, and I'm going to write 4 separate pieces of code to handle each of those 4 conditions. Now, starting with update lower, I'm calculating a first bar, and as I said, if we dropped our stick on from above or pushed it up from below, the first thing it's going to hit is the highest or the lowest. So the first bar is the lowest, using the symbol, the time frame, looking at mode low, meaning the low prices, for the length that we specified, and from the start bar. So that gives me that point to begin, or it gives me that bar number to begin with. And then I'm going to be using this next bar in the loop that we'll get to in a moment, and I'm initializing that to the first bar value. I also have a value for that first bar. I'm just setting that to 0 at the moment. That will be reset again soon. And as I said, depending whether that low bar is on the left or the right, I'm going to want to have an uptrend or a downtrend. And to know whether it's the left or the right, I'm just calculating the mid bar, which is just start plus length divided by 2. And this best slope will also be used in the loop that's coming, because as I said, I'm looking at the slope changing, and we're doing the lower at the moment. So if you can imagine that the bar is gradually tilting upwards, I want to find the point where the bar has tilted upwards the least, or if it's a down slope, I'm trying to find the point where it's tilted downwards the least. So the first of our conditions, if the first bar is greater than or equal to the mid bar. Now, bar numbers count from right to left, so if first bar is greater than or equal to mid bar, then the first bar, the low point, is to the left of center, and that means that the trend line is then going to be pushed up on the right, so it will be an upsloping trend line. And now I go into a loop. While next bar is greater than or equal to mid bar. I've already initialized next bar here, it's the same as first bar. But what I'm going to be doing is looking to see if, as I gradually tilt the trend line upwards, if I find a bar, as I did on the example, where it is still to the left of the middle, then I'm going to reset the pivot point. So while next bar is greater than mid bar, first bar equals next bar. On the first loop through, that does nothing because they're already the same, but if I have found another bar, then that will change. First value here, I'm getting the low value from that bar. So I simply initialize first value with 0 here. Now I'm getting a value of that low bar, and best slope is 0. That's just initializing the best slope. So now what I'm doing is moving through the bars, beginning at this first bar, because I know that since it's an upward slope, nothing to the left of that first bar can affect the trend. Only bars to the right. So for int I equals first bar minus 1, starting at the next bar in sequence, while I is greater than or equal to m start, I minus minus. So I'm counting from left to right, and remember the rightmost bar is 0, so I'm counting down. I'm just calculating a working variable here, pos equals first bar minus I, so that tells me how far I am into the range, and then I'm calculating the slope from the value of this first bar to the value of the I bar. And that's simply the low value from bar I, which I get with I low, M symbol, M time frame I, minus that first value, which we've calculated here, divided by pos, which is the number of bars. So slope is simply the difference between the two low values divided by the number of bars in between. And because this is upward sloping, that will give me a positive value, so it's a positive slope. Because the low for bar I must be higher than the low for first value, otherwise we would have found this when we first did the search for lowest. So now I have a positive slope. If next bar equals first bar, so that's to cope with the first iteration through this loop, or the slope is less than the best slope. So remember, I'm trying to find the least slope. This is going to go through every bar, and I might find one that has a particularly high low value, and then I'll have a very steep slope. What I'm doing is looking for this slope value that I've just calculated to be the least slope. I want the most shallow slope that I can find, because anything that's more than that will intersect with other candles. So I'm looking for the least positive slope. And best slope, well, I've initialized that to 0, but I've handled that with this next bar equals first bar. So on the first iteration, this is going to be true. And after that, anytime I find a new slope that is less than the steepness of that slope that I've already found. So if this is true, then next bar equals I. So I have now found a new bar that is my best bar, and my best slope now becomes slope. And then I continue through the iteration. So this will go all the way to the end of the range, looking for the least positive slope. And once it's been through this for statement, it will come back to the while. And if next bar is still greater than or equal to the mid bar, it will just keep going. But this will stop as soon as I find a next bar that is on the right hand side of the middle, because that must be the best place. So now I'll just finish the while loop and then get into the opposite condition where first bar is less than mid bar. So here the else condition, first bar is less than mid bar, which means it's to the right hand side of the middle, and that means we have a downward slope. So this is on the lower trend line. The lowest point in the segment is on the right hand side of middle. So now we're going to begin tilting the trend up on the left. So we'll have a downward slope. And this is where the conditions are just that little bit different enough to be annoying. I still have a while loop, but in this case it's while next bar is less than mid bar instead of next bar greater than or equal to. I'm doing the same initialization. First bar is equal to next bar. First value is low symbol time frame first bar, and best slope is 0. A little bit of spacing here. And now my for loop, in this case, while I equals first bar plus 1, where here it was first bar minus 1. So in this case, I'm going to be counting to the left, beginning first bar plus 1, while I is less than start plus length, I plus plus. And now my position is I minus first bar instead of being first bar minus I. And the slope is now first value minus the low for bar I divided by position, which will give me a negative slope. But I'm still looking for the most shallow slope that I can. So I'm looking for the least negative value. Same condition here though, if next bar is equal to first bar, or slope is greater than best slope. So remember, this is a negative number, so I'm looking for the least negative slope. So if slope is greater than best slope, or this is the first loop through, next bar equals I, and best slope equals slope. So those two lines are the same as they were above. And that finishes the while and the else. And now that I have all of that, I have calculated everything I need to set the starting point, or a starting point, and the slope. The actual starting point doesn't matter. It will be the bar that we've just found. But you can still use just that one point and the slope to calculate any other value along the trend line. So all I do then, m lower trend dot slope, so m lower trend is my structure variable, dot slope equals the best slope, base, let me go back up to the structure and show this. There we go. So the trend has a slope and a base, and the base is the point, and the point has a bar, price, and a time. Go back down here. So the bar is now first bar, the price is the first value, and the time, I'm just calculating that from the first bar. I don't really use the time, but I'm storing it there in case it's useful later. So now I have a starting point being a bar number and value and a slope. And I store all of those in lower trend. And so that's the update lower. There's also an update upper. So I'll just type all of this in first and then explain everything to you. Now this is the update upper function, and this is all just a variation on the update lower. First bar now, instead of being lowest, is I highest, and using mode high to get the high prices. Mid bar is the same, next bar is the same as before, best slope. I still have an if first bar is greater than or equal to mid bar, but now because we're looking at the upper side, that will form a down slope. And then I still have a while next bar greater than or equal to mid bar. Now when I recalculate first value, I'm getting I high for the first bar, where previously in the lower I was getting the I low. This loop is still counting down from first bar minus 1, while I is greater than or equal to M start, I minus minus. Position calculation is still first bar minus I. The slope now is high for bar number I, using symbol and time frame, minus first value, divided by position, but this now gives me a negative slope because I have found a starting bar to the left of center, and now I'm lowering the trend line on the right hand side, so I have a negative slope. It's downward trending. Same condition here, if next bar is equal to first bar, or slope is greater than best slope. So because I've got a negative slope, I'm trying to find the least negative, which means I'm looking for a slope that is higher than the previously found best slope. And then just next bar equals I and best slope equals slope. Same conditions there. Else, and this is an upslope, while next bar is less than mid bar, same as it was in the lower. First bar equals next bar, first value equals I high. Now I'm counting upwards from first bar plus 1, while I is less than start plus length, I plus plus. Position equals I minus first bar, exactly as it was for the second condition in the lower. Slope is first value minus I high for bar number I divided by position, and that gives me a positive slope. So this is the situation where I've found a first bar that is to the right of the middle, and now I'm lowering the left hand side of the trend line, and I'm getting an upward sloping line. Next bar equals first bar, or slope is less than best slope. I'm trying to find the least positive slope, the most shallow slope. next bar equals I, best slope equals slope. All the same. And then I just save these values again as they were before, but now upper trend.slope and upper trend.base are being set with the best slope, first bar, first value, and the time for that first bar. Now those are all the calculations. That's all the hard parts. The rest is just getting values back. Start with the upper value at, and this takes an index. So this is the upper value at that uses a bar number. And that will simply return value at, that's the internal method, and we'll see that later, passing in the index and the upper trend. Because that upper trend tells me a starting point and a slope. That's all I need to calculate the value at a particular bar number. So I'm calling this value at to get that result. Now the second upper value at method takes a time rather than an index. And to do that, all I'm doing is calling the iBar shift method, passing the symbol, time frame, time, and false. That's this passed in time here. And that just gives me an index, and then I simply call value at, index, and the upper trend. The lower value at functions are the same, but I will be passing through M lower trend. So exactly the same, calling value at, index, M lower trend, value at, index, M lower trend. And now the value at function, which does that interpolation, it accepts an index and a trend, passed by reference, ampersand here. First I need an offset, which is the bar number minus the index. So that gives me the distance away from this central point that I've found. And then I calculate the value at that index, which is the base price, trend base price, plus the slope multiplied by that offset. And that will give me the value at any point along the chart based on this trend line. Now something to note here, this trend is based on a start bar and a number of bars. Obviously every time a new bar is created, this calculation will be wrong because it's a different start bar number. So you do need to call the update methods every time a new bar is created. And then I just return the value. I think that's everything. I'll do a compile here just to check for syntax. And that worked. Now I have two scripts that I've written to demonstrate this. These scripts will call this class and calculate values and then actually draw the trend lines on screen for a segment. I've created the scripts already under this trendlines folder. I've created an MQ5 version and an MQ4, but they are, apart from this part of the comment, identical. I include orchard trendlines trend high low.mqh. I'm taking an input of the start bar and number of bars, which I'm just defaulting to 1 and 50. Declaring a variable of type C trend high low. It's a pointer asterisk trend. Here's a new C trend high low using that start and length. I'm going to call the update. I'm just going to print the values from the last point on that line. So start plus length, I'm getting the upper value at and the lower value at. Then just in case I've already drawn some trend lines, I'm calling the object delete, deleting the upper trend and the lower trend line. Then I'm going to create an upper trend line, which will be an object trend. And this scrolls off the screen a little. Let me wrap that around a bit. And this trend line will have a start time using the iTime for the symbol, period, and that start plus length. And a starting price point will be from that trend object, upper value at, start plus length. So I'm simply getting the time for any given bar and the value for that same bar. And then the second point, you need to specify 2 points for a trend line. The second point is the time for bar number 0 and the trend value for bar number 0. It's probably worth mentioning also here, if you do begin your trend line, so set up your object using bar number 0 as the start point, then there's a potential that that trend line is going to change at every tick as the high or low changes. So I normally only begin the trend lines at bar number 1 because I'm looking for a break of that trend line. But if you do want to use bar number 0 as the starting point, just be aware that you probably need to call the update every tick. And then I'm just setting the color and the width of that trend line. And then I'm doing the same for the lower trend line. I'll wrap this line around as well. But in this case, I'm just calling trend lower value at, and still using start plus input length and 0, and that just gives me 2 points that I can draw a lower trend line. And then I'm setting the color and the width. And finally, I delete trend because it's an object. Let me compile that, and that's fine. Let me flip over to the chart and I'll run that script and just show it in action for you. Now this is a 1 hour Euro USD chart. I'm just going to drag my script onto the chart. My input's 1 and 50. Okay, and now it's drawn 2 trend lines. The upper trend line just touches a point here, and the lower trend line, can't tell which, but it touches one of these bars here, possibly both. The lower trend line touches this bar and this bar. Now you can see that it's intersecting with this bar here. That's because I've set the trend line to draw from start plus length, where the actual calculations only go from start bar to start plus length minus 1. So this hasn't been included in the calculations, but the trend line is actually intersecting with that. Let me choose a different time frame. I'll start that at bar 10, for example. Now I can see it's formed a more conventional channel. The 2 lines are almost parallel. And now it is touching this bar because that's included in the range of calculation, and touching this bar, where the upper trend line touches here. And because I began at bar number 10, it's not looking at these bars that are actually penetrating the trend line. So you can see there's a breakout happening there, or at least it's moving horizontally past that trend line. And just one more. I'll leave that at 10, but I'll change this to only 20 bars. Now it's looking over a shorter period, and you can see I've got a pennant shape forming, and the price is moving horizontally. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the point of this exercise is not to draw these lines, it's to create that class which you can then use in your experts or indicators to simply get a trend value at any point on the chart. If you found this useful, please click the like button. And if you want to see more of our videos, click subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we do release new videos. Thank you for watching.